We're going to paint a peony together using value-shaped strategies, and this is what we're going to do for the new year, so let's get started. Let's start with a giant disclaimer. There are a million ways to paint a peony. This is just one of them. This is the way that I prefer to paint. I admire all painters, so I'm not saying anybody should paint the way I do. This is just one suggestion of a way to simplify forms, especially a form that's as complicated as a peony. So what I do is I've mixed some alizarin crimson and some ultramarine blue, and I'm going to put in my darkest darks first. Now, this is not the way most watercolor painters work. Most watercolor painters work from their lightest lights and then into their darkest darks. So I'm a little strange that way, but this works for me. This is still reading as a bit of a red, and I'm finding the crevices in that peony. If you study peonies, and the more you paint them, the more you tend to study them, is they're very different from roses because the forms are not rounded. The forms inside a peony tend to be jagged and have squarish kind of petals. And that's one of the reasons why I chose a number 10 brush to put a number 10 flat. Number 10 flat Kolinsky red sable brush. Now I'm checking the value against the value in the picture. And I always like to say, I am not a matchy-matchy painter. I'm not matching the colors on the photograph to the colors on my palette. I've found over time for me that's a big mistake because there are things that happen in photographs that are very different from what happens in real seeing. And so I'm matching for value, not for color. So I've got my darkest values in. I found my darkest shapes. Now I'm on the side mixing some midtones. The midtones are going to be cadmium red, and I'm also mixing up a permanent rose, and I'm using Naples yellow as well, and even a little bit of orange. I want to go lighter, so I want to come up with color dabs, and I'm checking. What I just did with the value finder was to check and make sure that the color that I'm putting in now, which is mostly a permanent rose, is lighter than the dark shapes I put in first. So my only rule right now is, now that I have my darks established in terms of shapes, I can't put anything else in that's as dark as my step number 1 was. So that's my strategy right here. The other thing that I'm doing is I didn't use a lot of water to come up with this color. Like I could have taken the rose and used a lot of water and watered it down in order to get a lighter color. But if you use water to keep getting your lighter and lighter and lighter colors, the painting will look kind of washed out. So all the paint that I use is about the strength of, I don't want to say strength, but about the consistency of gravy or really thick milk. Almost, I would say, like a cream. So my point is I'm using a lot more pigment than water. Again, I'm not suggesting this for anybody else. There are watercolor painters that build up layer after layer after layer after layer. I'm just not that kind of painter. My kind of painting is I want to get in, I want to find the basic shapes, the dark shapes, the medium shapes, and the light shapes, and then I want to get out. It's my preferred way to work. And it is a way that you can work. It's a way that I approach all my paintings. It doesn't have to be a peony, it can be a face, it can be anything. I'm all about value shapes and value relationships. So that was enough of the permanent rose. Now I've shifted into what looks to me like a cadmium red with a little bit of Naples yellow in it. And I checked it. I didn't have to check it with a value finder. I just checked it on that white card to make sure that it was as light as the color that I put in before. These are all midtones. I want to make sure they're all midtones. So I'm still looking for value shapes, and I could have kept going. I could have done the whole thing in one color, but my sign-off is sort of mass for value, mix for color. So I find my masses, and in this case, the peony is mostly midtone. That's my big mass that I have to deal with. And so I'm going to come up with a bunch of different colors in order to fill in that mass. And if you look at flowers, or I'm going to say almost anything, you will find that things are made up of a multitude of colors when you look really closely, not just one. All right, now that's enough of that, and so now I'm shifting, and I'm what do you call it? Mixing around the color wheel to maintain brightness. I want to have a lighter color, but I don't want anything to get dull, so I moved into some orange. but it still has a little bit of rose in it and a little bit of Naples yellow. I want to make sure that every color that I mix in terms of my midtones has some relationship to what's come before it, so the colors kind of go together. So these mixes will have, so even though it looks like an orange, that's not an orange from the tube. It's an orange with a little bit of that permanent rose and a little bit of Naples yellow in it. And the reason it goes is because it's already made up of colors that I've used already. Nothing's coming in new at this point. So in a sense, it's you know, it's the same as painting with a limited palette. That's what I'm talking about here. All right, still looking for value shapes. Now you might have noticed that I'm leaving whites, but there's no, what do you call it, masking fluid on the paper. I don't use masking fluid. I'm not saying I never use it, but almost every time I use it, I'm unsuccessful. It tends to tighten up my style, and when I go to take it off, it always has that sort of look as if something had been pasted on and taken off, and I don't want that. I like to have soft edges. I like to have hard edges too, but if an edge is so hard that it draws your attention away from the form, then I feel like my painting isn't successful. So in my head, what I'm doing is I'm just painting. I've already established in my head where those whites, where the lightest lights are, and I'm painting around them. I'm going to leave them alone. Now what I'm doing is I finally am using some water, and this is triad work. This is Naples yellow, alizarin crimson, and a little bit of cerulean blue, in order to make those whiter looking, I shouldn't say whiter, but lighter looking petals around the outside of the peony read as being not pink. Oh boy, that's a hard thing to say. You know, sometimes when I used to match colors exactly, I would always end up with a completely pink form or a completely red form. And one thing that I realized when I started in this painting, if you remember back to step one, is I used some ultramarine blue, and so I knew later, even when I get to the lighter forms, I want to have some blue in those lighter forms, but I put them in sort of the consistency of a wash. Again, so the whole thing sort of integrates together. When you paint with only one color and it's completely monochromatic, it sort of does, your painting won't have the same intensity as it will if you can use more colors around the color wheel. And in this case, I've used Naples yellow, I've used an orange, I've gone down into ultramarine blue, I haven't gone into indigo yet, but I will. And I've gone into viridian for my greens. So I'm covering a lot of the color wheel here. So I'm aware that I want to have the biggest value range I can have, and I also want to have as much of the color wheel happening as I can. But I'm accessing that color wheel by using a limited palette, by mixing those colors from each other on my palette, not introducing new colors from a tube, because that, like I said, that can look pretty haphazard. All right. So things are going along pretty well here. I'm done with my midtones and squinted my eyes and realized, and I'm going to have to decide at the end of this whether I think this painting passes or fails, but one of the intriguing things, or maybe difficult things about this particular peony picture, is that the background had competing forms and competing values. And I thought, well, I could make the background really diffused and kind of washy, if you know what I mean. But I realized if I do that, then I'm going to end up with an islands surrounded by oceans painting. An island surrounded by oceans painting is when you have the form in the middle of the paper and then just like washes around it. For my eye, it never works. For my eye, I try to avoid an islands to oceans painting if I can. And in order to do that, I'm going to have to anchor this in some way. And I think I anchored it in by making sure that the left side of the peony has a darker background behind it than the right side of the peony. I think I managed to anchor it in, but you know, the jury's still out. I just painted this a few minutes ago. This is what's interesting. If you ever not videotape, but yeah, whatever you call this, you know, make a picture of yourself as you're painting. Like right here, I almost feel like, wow, that was enough. I had it. Whoops, the painting shifted there. And then I almost wish I could rewind sometimes back to a place, because I realized right here things started to go in a direction that I had a different choice, but I didn't know it at the time. But that's what painting is. You know, you never. I shouldn't say you never. Maybe some people 100% hit it the way they expect to hit it. I like an element of surprise, and I'm endlessly surprised by what I come up with. So now things are mostly done, but now I go back. Um, I usually leave the room, come back in, take a look at it, and I realize, okay, I made good decisions about my darkest darks to begin with, but I could stretch the value range a little bit more. I'm going to see, I'm mixing up some indigo with some ultramarine blue, and also with some that alizarin crimson, and I made a dab. You can see it's darker than my original dab, which I started as my darks. And this is often the case, is that when I'm at the very, very end, I haven't quite achieved the value range that I want to get, and so I'll go back in and put in just those key shapes that I see. So that's what's happening here. And of course, anytime you do something in one part of the painting, it's going to affect a different part of the painting. And I realized, all right, there's some really dark moments in that foliage too. I need to account for that. So I went back in, and I should have made a test dab on the left, but I didn't. But this is Viridian with ultramarine blue, and again, a little bit of alizarin crimson in it. So again, I'm still using a limited palette. I'm still mixing everything from the key colors that I started with. And you can see the whites of the white stay, the whites of the paper stayed white. That's why my sign off is keep the whites of your paper white and your paints wet. Again, this is what I like to do. I find it incredibly enjoyable to find value shapes and sort of put this thing together as if it's a jigsaw puzzle. But everybody has their own way of working. I don't judge. I just think this is a really fun way to work. And it's quite similar, I guess, to the way my friends who are oil painters paint. And I just find it works for me. And when I'm done with it, I'm generally happy, and then I move on to the next thing. So this is my pink peony for the day. The more peonies you paint, the more you get a sense of them. This is the end. I wanted to take a picture of the palette at the very, very end. If you look down at your palette and it's gray at the end of your painting, then you have a problem. And the problem is that if you look down and it's completely gray, it means you've neutralized everything. I know I've kept my color clean throughout a painting if my palette looks like this at the end of a 30-minute stretch. And there's the finished piece. So remember to keep the whites of your paper white, your paints wet, mass for value, mix for color. Please join my YouTube channel, and I'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.